Hello, in this video I'm going to whiz through a sample question that we looked at in class for the AS Media Institutions and Audiences exam about the newspapers. Right, the question was this: media production is dominated by global institutions which sell their products and services to national audiences. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Okay, so let's look at the question really closely. It's quite, they're quite long and reasonably complicated, these questions, so you've got to look at them and pick out the key words. So it's asking us about media production. It's asking us about the production of newspapers, if we're writing about newspapers. Is dominated by global institutions. Do we agree with that? Which sell their products and services to national audience. How far do you agree? That means you argue for and against. That means you have to say, well, I agree with it. I do agree with it because of this and this. However, I also think this and this mean that the statement might not be true. Media production is dominated by global institutions. Is news dominated by global institutions? So how far do you agree? Well, this is what we looked at in the lesson. We said yes, to some extent. You can argue, this is the yes bit, that news media is dominated, particularly when you look at newspapers as a way of getting across news. So the case study you'd apply there is probably Rupert Murdoch's media empire, and you'd use the information and the facts that you've learned from the videos on Takeaway Media about this. Okay, so you'd write about that at some length and give examples. So I don't know, you could talk about the Times or News of the World in Britain. You could also write about the fact that regional newspapers, such as the Oxford Mail, are also dominated by American institutions, and you need to find out about that. But that would be another good point. So even though it seems like the Oxford Mail is or the Oxford Times as a regional newspaper is a local institution, it's actually owned in America. For the no section, okay, you could talk about new media, I think, because you could talk about how the growth of new media has challenged the dominance of the older institutions. Give examples, write about user-generated content, write about the idea of putting comments on news. The central point you'd be making really is that it's difficult for institutions to dominate when production is so fragmented, because people are making their own news and posting their own news on the internet. You could argue that therefore, because there's much greater plurality of voices, global institutions can't dominate. You could also write here about how it's difficult to dominate when it's difficult to make money from the internet, and talk about, again, Murdoch's attempt to do that. Okay, so there's the ideas that we sort of came up with. There's lots of other things you could write about instead, but that you could sort of base an essay around organising those points into a coherent, well-written essay.